All right. Hello, Flynn.
Hey, man.
What in the world is sensory motor learning? Okay, we are live. All right. Hello, Flynn.
Hey, man.
Okay, so today we are going to have a quick chat about something that you've told me a lot about that's piqued our interest, I think, at AS, and so much so that it's the subject of our first theme. It is sensory motor learning. So for people who don't know who Flynn is, he is a massive nerd, but also really cool. So if you want to find out more about his movement, just check his Instagram and website out. We won't get into it here, but Flynn, let's jump straight into it. What in the world is sensory motor learning?
Yeah. Sensorimotor learning it's really a way of understanding any kind of learning or any kind of movement learning. I think a simple analogy, you gave me the cue to explain it like you were a 5-year-old, and I think that's a great way to go about things. And it's almost a sensory motor way, because to explain something really simply, you need to connect ideas to things that you sort of already sense, you already know. So sensory motor learning, you can think about it like drawing a map inside your brain of a movement or a task that you want to complete. If you wanted to go to the shops, let's say, but you didn't have a map of where the shops were, you would struggle to move across that, complete that task successfully. And in the same way, the sensory motor system is a system in the brain that holds the map of movements that we would potentially like to do. So when you don't have the map, so we can think about the sort of hold my beer syndrome that any YouTube video showing a handstand or a backflip or something like this, people always say, oh yeah, I could do that, hold my beer. And if you try and do any of these things, you'll realize very quickly that they're far more difficult than they might look. And it's not immediately obvious why somebody couldn't just arrange themselves into a perfect handstand after looking at it only once, right? It's actually not obvious why that's the case, and why you couldn't just do this thing very easily.
Okay. So are you saying that the reason people can't do a handstand is not because they don't have the strength or don't have the core or whatever? You're saying there's something to do with a map, something to do with like not your ability to walk there, but knowing where to go?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And so sensory motor learning is in that sense very much about drawing the map required to move yourself to the task or location that you want to move yourself to.
Okay, so it's kind of like figuring out what your body needs to do in like what order, in what way, basically to connect the thing. Okay, interesting. Like, give me an example of what this looks like when it's done well and what it looks like when it's done poorly.
Yeah. Tennis, I think, provides a great example of sensory motor learning in a less predictable environment, because obviously the tennis ball is always coming to you in a slightly different area, and you're having to adapt your movements within each moment. In that sense, you have to sense where you are in space, and you have to predict where the ball is going to be, and that element of prediction adds a little bit more complexity than maybe we wanted to go into right now, but it's also a very relevant part of this whole process. But to give a simpler example would be, have you ever seen cup stacking before? Yeah. So that would be a very simple example of sensorimotor learning, because it's very static and very predictable, which means that you can do it extremely quickly when you practice enough. But if anyone doesn't know what that looks like, it's pretty much what it sounds like. You're stacking cups as quickly as possible into various shapes and things like this. And you can really think about that as practicing this very specific map. So that is moving your hand from this position to this position, da, 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 da. So you've just got this very simple map, and you're just practicing that over and over and over and over again until it becomes as familiar as sort of walking down to the shops is for most people.
Okay, so other than the weird people that actually do cup stacking, give us an example for most of the people that people would have come across, a thing that they already learn in a bit of like a sensory motor way. And what's an example of something that is unfortunately usually taught in a way that's not sensory motor integrated?
Yeah, good question. So a classic example would just be tying your shoelaces. We typically learn to do this very quickly. You can do it without paying any attention to it because you've drawn this map so many times. And you'll also find that when you try to deviate from the map that you normally draw, you'll actually find that quite difficult. So if you've always tied your shoelaces in one way, and then suddenly you decide, oh, I'm going to tie it actually in a slightly different way, you will find that your hands will magnetize towards the same sort of pattern. So you can almost think about these maps, sensory motor maps, as kind of attractor states which pull movement in like little grooves in which things will sort of fall into the place of.
So are you saying the way to make that movement like as smooth and groovy as tying your shoelaces, like you can use that and apply it to any type of movement, make it that simple?
So that's a really, really interesting point, right? Because things change. And so now we have a great contrast between the cup stacking example and the tennis example. In the cup stacking example, it's like, maybe that's fine that you do it the same way every single time. But in the real world, things are not always the same, which means that you need to be adaptive with your movement. You need to fit your movement to the environment that you're in. And any more sort of complex, whether it's sports, football, tennis, whether it's dance, parkour, acrobatics, anything like this is going to be much more adaptive. There's going to be some patterns that are a bit more predictable, like stacking the cups, but you're going to be applying those patterns, those maps, into different scenarios.
Okay, give me some examples of problems that people would have that they can solve through sensory motor learning, like common problems, especially movement practitioners, teachers, things like that.
Yeah, so I can tell you a quick story. I was sitting once in a cafe in a sports hall, and as I was working on my laptop and I was looking down over the balcony, there was a trampoline class going on, and the people at the class seemed like they'd been practicing for a few years. Like they were doing, flips and things like this. They were doing them quite effectively. And there was one guy who was practicing a double front flip, which maybe sounds very intimidating, but it's quite safe, because when you undershoot a double front flip, you're actually landing on your back going towards your feet. Whereas if you undershoot a double back flip, you're landing on your head or your chest going towards your feet. So that movement is a little bit less safe, but a double front flip is relatively safe. Anyway, this gentleman is practicing the movement, and he's landing on his back, and it looks quite safe. The coach, who's standing by the side, and he looks like he knows what he's doing, and it's all very legit looking class. The coach then comes up onto the trampoline bed. He speaks with the student. They speak for a couple of minutes. the student goes to jump again, goes to do the double front flip, and you kind of expect, right, that the coach has imparted some wisdom to the student, and then the student will suddenly improve the way that they're moving because they have a better idea and a better understanding of the way that the movement goes. And the next attempt that this guy goes for, he lands just barely missing his neck, totally out of it. And I was watching this, and it blew my mind, because I expected that the advice, which from what I could understand, seemed, I'm sure it was good advice, that the advice would have given this guy a boost in his ability, but it was actually the other way, that the advice seemed to detract, or at least make the movement the same. And so I think that would be an example of a situation in which understanding the sensory motor nature of learning was not applied, because the advice was given in a very intellectual way. I'm going to tell you how this movement works, but what the guy probably needed was some kind of exercise to actually embody the idea that was being described. And so I think we see this a lot in the gym, where you see people maybe describing, I mean, I've been absolutely guilty of this in parkour and in a lot of other situations, but more describing, for example, with the mechanics of breathing. Maybe you can, describe Boyle's law and the way that gas moves in a specific gradient. That's not going to help anyone breathe better.
Why do I feel like you've tried this?
Oh.
But yeah, did he undershoot and land on his neck, or overshoot and land on?
He undershot. So he
Oh wow!
he,
So
he,
one and just okay.
Quarter, yeah.
Yeah. So what would be an alternative? Like, okay, give us an example. Let's say you've taken maybe this trampoline example, maybe another example. Okay, what would be the sensory motor guided way of doing this?
Yeah, for that student in that instance, perhaps it would be just trying to do 1.5 front flips to land on his back. So doing that with the intention of just doing this, actually doing that and finding space within that movement. So rather, if you imagine, if you've ever jumped on the spot and done a 360, you can try this right now, that when you first do it, the movement will just go by in a flash. And if you think back and reflect on the movement, you're going to go, oh, I actually have no idea what happened there at all. I can't really remember what happened in the movement. But if you practice it, and you become more specific with the movement, you'll notice that the 360 jump actually becomes more spacious. So your experience of it will become more spacious.
So it feels like stall 360 rather than
yeah.
Brrr.
Exactly. And so I think one way to approach that would be, with the double front flip, would be to give the student a simpler task, but to do the task with a higher, with a quality where they have more familiarity, more spaciousness, maybe more calm in the body, and a lower kind of intensity in what they were doing.
Interesting.
And
to
take that back to the analogy of the map, it would be like trying to draw a map whilst you're sprinting, or you're going really quickly in a car, or you've got your eyes closed or something like this. It's going to be very difficult to actually know where it is that you've been if you're moving as quickly as you can. Whereas if you're just sort of walking gently through a space, it's going to be much easier to notice what's around you, what kind of, oh, there's a bush over there, there's, you're going to notice more detail. So that's also a key principle that we can speak about in the learning process, is reducing that intensity of what you're experiencing.
Yeah, because if you're hurtling, like you're probably just too busy gripping and you don't realize what's going on.
Yeah, like Olympic weightlifters learn their technique not with their heaviest weight. They do technical work with a PVC pipe or a 20 kilo bar. So that would be another example of the same kind of
Super interesting. Okay, so basically what I'm getting is that people too often they're just like intellectualizing or verbalizing what the movement means to them and assuming that that's sufficient for another person to understand and self-embody that thing. But you're like, nah, there's a map, and for that map to exist in your head, I mean, I guess you can describe a map to someone, but it's not superbly useful, you know? It's like, okay, there's this map, and then there's this road, and you take a slight left and then a bit right. But the person's not really getting it.
Right.
What you're saying is you try to put them in the woods one section at a time and let them feel it out themselves. And you let them find their own way through the woods, kind of thing.
This kind of thing.
Okay.
Maybe to build on that analogy, you wouldn't necessarily, put them in the woods with a bear where they're sort of stressed or panicked, but it would be, we're just going to go into a simpler environment where you can map out what needs to be done.
Yeah, this is making like a bunch of sense to me, because ultimately the movement needs to be done by you yourself, right?
Yeah.
So like the more you're involved in figuring it out, I guess the easier it is. Okay, now I want you to tell me, like, how did you come to this? Because like sensory motor learning is probably not a phrase anybody wakes up in the morning and decides to Google. So like, how did you come across it?
A combination of things. 3 years ago, I snuck into a lecture at Imperial University. Well, actually, my friend invited me, but it's more dramatic sounding if I say that I snuck in, by a guy called Karl Friston, who's one of the most prominent neuroscientists. And he's come up with a sort of grand theory of psychology and biology, which is called the free energy principle, which I won't go into now, actually. But one of the things that I took away from his lecture was this clear separation between living creatures. So if I'm a living creature as separate to you, or a living system as separate to you, there are parts of me that sense, parts of me that take information about the world into my organism, into myself, and there are parts of me that act and that affect the environment. So there's this feedback loop between sensing information about the environment, roughly, processing that information, and then influencing the environment through action. So there's this feedback loop: information in, information processed, and action out. And this sort of led me down the pathway of trying to map these concepts onto my own teaching practice, and trying to understand that it's not always the case that what we're sensing, so the information about the world coming in, it's not always accurate to the actual world. And so you'll
Give me
tend
an
to
example.
see that.
Whoa. Give me an example. This is.
Yeah. Whoa. Simple example would be, I'm reaching over to put a glass of water on the table. I think the table is in front of me. I put the glass down and I realize it's actually a little bit to the side of me, and then the glass of water falls down on the floor. So in that example, I have a sense of where the table is. I act, and then it's not actually, it's actually somewhere else. Another example would be with lifting. I think a deadlift gives a simple example, where people are often getting to the top of the deadlift and hyperextending the lumbar spine. And if you tell them this, they'll be surprised. So they feel, their experience is that they're standing up perfectly straight. But the reality is, you can see, or as a mirror would inform them, they're actually extending their spine. So they're actually leaning far back behind their feet. So again, in that example, you've got what you're sensing about your body or about the environment, and then you have the what is actually going on.
I think this is the first time I'm starting to understand why this hyperextension in the deadlifting happens. I have just a big idea that's come to my head. You can tell me if it makes any sense. But do you think this happens because normally the way people sense that they're straight is not anything to do with their back, but more like the feeling of the weight distribution across their feet? They feel like, okay, when the weight is equally distributed, I'm probably standing upright. But in a deadlift, you have a shit ton of weight now in front of you. So to have that sort of equal weight distribution, you end up having to pull a little bit more. So to create the sensory feeling of being upright requires the body to arch. Could that be like a thing?
It could be something like this. I'm not so sure about that. There's a common idea that that our posture, our uprightness, is in response to gravity, but experiments have shown that that is not the case, and it's actually where we organize our posture based on these sort of small movements that we do, called postural sway. So you'll notice that when you stand, you're never perfectly still. You're always moving a little bit. So if you ever, pay attention to that, you'll notice that you're not sort of totally stiff, but you're gently swaying backwards and forwards, maybe left and right. And it's those micro movements that create a map of the sort of easiest point to return to. This is a bit of a tangent.
This is mind-blowing, though. Keep going.
But it's very cool. So it's something like, because it's a little bit easier to fall down than it is to get back up, your brain, I don't know what part, I'm not sure that it matters, retains that information, and from that information of where it's easiest to fall from and get back up to, you find the sort of average point of where it's going to be easiest to kind of recover to, if that makes sense. So it's not through just the sort of pull of Earth's gravity that you find your sense of uprightness, but it's actually through these sort of small movements. And so you can use that idea. It's called oscillation feedback, or proprioceptive feedback. And it's the same effect of if you're driving down an icy road, you would give the wheel of the car, you wouldn't drive normally like sort of like big movements. You actually do these very small movements, and that gives you, can you imagine that, like you're driving down a slippery road and it's like little tiny impulses that gives you more proprioceptive information about where the car is, and it makes it easier to control. So it's the same kind of.
Wow. Okay, this is definitely like something today I learned. That's super cool.
And you can use it as well. So it's not just like a cool fact. It's something that you can use to gain awareness, sensitivity.
So you're saying just the act of making these small oscillatory movements helps you better sense what the map of the entire structure is. Okay. Wow. Okay. So what did this look like for you in your own like practice, in your movement? What changed? Could you see anything like different?
Yeah. So one question that I had, and that I'm still exploring, is a lot of my training in parkour and also strength training has been sort of large but basic movements. So if you imagine, in the same way that within strength training there are these sort of compound movements like a deadlift or a squat, in parkour there are also these sort of compound movements, which is like a precision jump. So that's when you jump from point A to point B, and you try and stay on point B without falling forward or backwards. So that's when you've stuck at precision, is when you land on point B and you land without falling forward or backward. And it's a very simple movement, just like a deadlift, but it can be scaled upward kind of forever. Just again, like a deadlift, like you can make a lot of progress with this simple movement. And so I train this sort of thing a lot in very large jumps, let's say, to small things. And I gained some capability within this type of movement, but I still really struggled with connecting these like smaller movements. So doing what in parkour we call flow, which is more of this sort of like dance-like style of practice. And I found that this idea of sensorimotor learning was really foundational for getting deeper into that side of things. So I think the biggest sort of revelation for me there was understanding that learning is a lot about learning difference. So learning the difference between being up here and being down here, or being having my weight fully supported on my hand, or having my weight actually a little bit behind my hand. These sorts of things, learning the difference between positions, learning the difference between sort of like relative positions between yourself and the floor, or yourself and the object. But in the same way that if you were learning to play the guitar, it's learning the difference between a C chord and a D chord that is learning. There's a moment when you're playing where your fingers covering one fret, and maybe your teacher says to you, or maybe you realize yourself, okay, the difference between this sounding like a bag of cats being thrown against a wall, which I'm not an advocate for. Don't throw bags of cats against the wall. Is the difference between a sort of harmonic noise and a disharmonic noise is that small adjustment of the finger. So in that way, you can understand learning as learning difference, and maybe learning the difference that is needed to achieve a goal. And so, yeah, to round that up, for me, moving away from or alongside these more sort of like large compound movements, which still require a lot of sensitivity, but have maybe a little bit less variety. So because you're doing often the same kind of movement, it's adaptive, but it's a little bit more like the cup stacking in a sense, because it's the same kind of pattern. Whereas the sort of like tennis analogy, which is much more like adaptive, and you have to be predicting all of this kind of new information. This sort of flow dance way of moving is much more like this sort of tennis sway in a sense. And I think for one to make progress in that, you need to be sensitive to these smaller movements and these smaller differences between movements.
Okay, so you're telling me, what I'm hearing is, to achieve this more fluid type of movement, again, it's not so much about like some strength or doing things dramatically differently. It's about noticing the difference between small things, like the angle of your body, or the placement of your feet, or the amount of force with which you're landing on something. And it's more to do with sensing the difference between those things.
Mm-hmm. And also having different options in the body as well, slightly finer options, like okay, I can round my upper back, but can I round my lower back? And that's going to make a huge difference with some of these movements, particularly when you're rolling on the floor and making contact with things like this. So
okay, I'm super intrigued, but also like 100% need more explanation on this. Thankfully, you are about to dive into 6 weeks
yes.
of explanation into this particular thing. It is going to be the topic of Ascending Strength's first theme. How how do you plan to tackle this over 6 weeks? And
Yeah.
what do you think someone who's learning, what can they expect to understand and then be able to do?
Yeah. So it's important for us to not make the mistake that our trampoline teacher made, which is to tell a bird how to fly, this kind of thing, right? So we want to provide scientific principles, where we're going to be diving into some studies by Daniel Wolpert, who's one of the leading scholars in this field. But alongside that more academic theoretical approach, we're also going to give people a selection of tasks to explore. So these will be skill-based movements that can be progressed and regressed, and we're going to use these as examples for the sensorimotor learning process. We're also going to give opportunities for people to apply these principles into movements that they are familiar with, movements that they're not so familiar with. And all of this will be done with a really interesting group of people. None of us as teachers claim to have all the knowledge in the world. That's really not the point. It's more about coming together and learning very much as a group. So there's going to be a lot of conversation and not just lecture.
Fantastic. Okay. So I am 100% sold, but I'm also going to be there. So it's not too much to say. But hopefully, yeah, I think people who are interested and watching can drop some questions for you in the comments that you can take a look at. Hopefully, we'll be doing like a bit of a question answer thing soon as well. And if you want to find out more about how you can get into AS, just check the Instagram page. The link should be in the bio. Send us a mail and we can get started. All right. Flynn, thanks a bunch. Looking forward to the theme. See you guys in the next one.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.